Good morning and welcome to the 26th meeting of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee. Can I please ask that all mobile devices are switched off and put away, please? We have apologies from Alec Cole-Hamilton, and I welcome Beatrice Wishart. He's here covering for him today. Agenda item 1 is witness diversity. Can I refer members to paper 1 in their pack? Committee is asked to note the current and future work to be undertaken to improve and monitor the diversity of committee witnesses, and in light of this, consider the 2018 to 19 witness diversity statistics for the Scottish Parliament committees. And I think we'll just go straight to members for comment on it. Angela.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think this was a very detailed and interesting report. It is certainly very positive to see that over the lifetime of the Scottish Parliament that there has been an improvement. But I'm sure that across Parliament, people would accept that we need to continue to focus on improving the diversity of witnesses. And, given the depth of the work completed to look at the figures and to devise an action plan, I thought it may be prudent and useful, perhaps if the convener was agreeable to write to all other parliamentary committees, just reinforcing and highlighting the work that has already been done, and suggesting or asking what further consideration will be given to this matter in due course.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Mary?
Thank you. Convener, can I just agree entirely with the comments that have been made by my colleague Angela Constance? I think it is an excellent report, and I think it will be very useful for committees to see the progress that has been made throughout this Parliament and the steps that have been taken to encourage diversity. But I think it will also be very useful for committees. It will give them almost a starting point. And if it generates that conversation within committees across all members of committees, what steps can be taken to improve the diversity of witnesses, it's a very useful step.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'd certainly want to acknowledge the recent work that's gone on and the improvements that we've seen, and I guess write and highlight the new guidance that's available for both external organisations and committee clerking teams. Okay, if everyone's in agreement. Agenda item 2 is Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill, and can I welcome Leitham Bartholomew, who is Head of the National FGM Centre. Good morning, Leitham. You're very welcome with us this morning. I think we'll go straight to questions from committee members. We have a lot to ask you this morning. Beatrice.
Yeah, good morning, Leitham. Just to wonder if you could give us a bit of a background about the work that you do, the history and how your organisation operates.
Okay, hi, good morning, and thanks a lot for inviting us to come to Scotland to share the work that we do in England. Now, the National FGM Centre started up in 2015 with funding from the Department for Education as part of the Children's Social Care Innovation Funding. And it's a partnership between Barnardo's, which is the largest children's charity in the UK, and the local government association. So the idea is that in 2015, we received funding, full funding from the DFE to work in 6 local authorities. So we called them back then pilot local authorities in the east of England. And we worked specifically only on FGM, and the approach was around looking at a system change in how local authorities respond to cases of FGM. Now, the model that we use, our intervention model, included we placed project workers at that time in children's social care. So they were based either in the front door, which is the multi-agency safeguarding hub, or the equivalent, or an assessment team within the local authority. And we either had a delegated authority, which meant that our worker acted as the local authority worker, or delegated responsibility, where we would work alongside the local authority social worker, and we will provide the intervention to support them in completing the assessments and doing direct work with families as well. Now, part of the model also involved community engagement, because we know that to end new cases of FGM by 2030, which is the UK and the UN's goal. It requires around engaging communities. So part of the work of the project workers, and later we recruited a community engagement worker, was around just that, engaging with communities to bring about that change in an attitudinal change. We also have a training arm, so we have a lead who is responsible for delivering training. So we know that one issue around FGM is about professional confidence and ensuring that they are culturally competent to respond to these cases. And the other part of it is our knowledge hub. So on our website, there's a part of it where there are resources on FGM, now other harmful practices as well. So it acts as a repository. Now, in 2017, the Department for Education decided to continue to fund our work, but we received part funding with the intention that the centre achieve sustainability. So between 2017 and March 2020, we have funding from the DFE. But it's important to point out that the funding that we receive tapers off, and this year it significantly tapers off, so we only receive 25% of our funding from the DFE. Bernardo's, as a charity, contributes a significant amount as well to the running of the centre. Now, in 2017, the department asked us not only to focus on FGM, but to focus on other harmful practices as well. So we also work on breast ironing, or breast flattening, and also child abuse linked to faith and belief. Now, so these harmful practices, so when we think about FGM, they overlap with other forms of harmful practices, for example, the breast ironing and child abuse linked to faith and belief. So the work that we do originally started off on FGM, then moved over to these harmful practices. But there's another aspect to our work that we do now as well, is that we have project workers that's based within health sector. So we have one that's based in one hospital in London, St. George's Hospital. She speaks Arabic, so she provides some form of translation as well for the woman and try to connect them with community organizations. And we have another worker based in London as well that that works with health visitors and school nurses as well, supporting women and providing that educational support for health practitioners as well. Yeah.
That's helpful. And in terms of the bill, do you support the aims to strengthen the existing legal protection? Yes,
because even though that we think that the child protection system is very robust, there are a number of measures that was brought in with the Serious Crime Act, for example, that strengthen the support that we think around prevention and prosecution for survivors as well, and for girls who are at risk. So, for example, one aspect would be that with the FGM Act, the extra territorial powers that comes with it. So, and what I mean by that is around if the offence happens overseas, it's as if it happens here in the UK as well, which isn't part of other legislation, existing legislation as well. So, yeah.
Okay.
With all of you. Obviously, there are very different legal and policy contexts across the UK. We have the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, who have responsibility for, health and education, yes. and a different legal system. And I'm conscious that you're funded by a UK Government department and the Local Government Association, yes. That covers England. But I would nonetheless be interested to know your views, either in terms of your experience south of the border or any reflections you have referencing Scotland about whether or not you think just now that there are existing approaches that are not being utilised to help protect people from FGM.
Yes, I would probably say the FGM protection orders, it's something that's still poorly understood by professionals, by communities as well. It's understanding in the sense that professionals don't understand the threshold around FGM protection orders. So it's sometimes considered to be the last option when it should be considered to be the first option. I think when we think about communities as well, part of it seemed to be very draconian for communities. Just having to engage with any legal system or any professionals in some communities is considered to be something that's very taboo. I think that as well, that there's a lot of some local authorities, the way how they respond when it comes to FGM protection orders. So if I'll give you an example, very recently, I was contacted by a police officer, and the concern that that officer had was that the mum was concerned about her partner wanting to cut their daughter, and she approached the local authority for support, and the response that she was given is that you could apply for the order in your own right, which left the mother feeling very distraught. Now, the police officer approached me and asked what should she actually tell the local authority. So I had to break it down and ask and say to her, this is what you should say to go back to the local authority. But in the end, the local authority did respond positively, and they did intervene. And they, from what I understand, they received the FGM protection order as well. So I think that one of the biggest things for us is the lack of understanding and awareness around FGM protection orders.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Fulton.
That's good. Convener, good morning. You talked there about the FGM order that was put in place. You've said in your submission as well that we know that FGM has been practised in the UK. What evidence do you have to back that up, and why do you think there's only been one prosecution in the UK?
Okay, so evidence. Now, at the FGM Centre, we have worked with just over now 250 women and about 15 girls who've been cut. And in at least 2 of those cases, we know 2 women, their stories that they've been cut here in the UK. One, actually, she was cut and didn't disclose it until she turned 18 because she was aware of mandatory reporting, and she didn't want her parents to be prosecuted. So the approach I was taking in that case was to focus on the cutter. But it was very difficult for that young person to remember the details because it happened to her when she was younger. Well, that's just cases, and we've worked with survivors as well, cases that survivors who haven't been referred to local authorities, but in our working with communities where they have said that the disclosures that they were actually cut here in the UK as well. We must admit that the numbers that we know of are very small, because it's a huge step to actually make a disclosure about anything like that, knowing the consequences for your parents and for your family members. Sorry, I forgot the second part of your question.
I forgot it myself.
So no, what?
Sorry, the prosecution. Why there's only been one prosecution?
Yeah, I think that. So there are a number of reasons. One, I would say, is that as I just said, giving evidence against your parents is in some communities is a huge step. And I know that FGM is cloaked under this whole guise that it's done for love, and when you're brought up in a culture thinking that that's what it's done and it's love, it's done very hard. I mean, if you think about communities where if FGM isn't practiced for any child or young person, just giving evidence against your parents is a very difficult thing. One other reason is that we know that there is a lack of pediatricians with the expertise to be able to examine girls, and the CPS, they would need that medical evidence. So in response to that, the centre, we are having a roundtable discussion on the 3rd of December, bringing together a number of medical and legal professionals and the police as well, to look at the reasons why there are such few pediatricians, and even if they can medically examine girls, they don't want to as well, because it would require giving evidence in court as well. There have been a few cases, well, probably I think as well, like there's one case where it was a failed prosecution, and we do know that the health professionals in that particular case, they were, their work was not actually, I was thinking about the right word, celebrated by the judge because it was considered to be not a good piece of work. So that in itself could be a barrier for medical practitioners coming forward to want to medically examine girls. And I think that for us, FGM protection orders, it's a preventative order which obviously prevented FGM from happening. And so that could be another reason why there are not prosecutions, because we're actually responding before girls have been cut as well, so they're being protected. And another reason why there's very few prosecutions as well is that I think that that we can't forget that FGM is a very hidden thing. We would never know the true prevalence. We would never know, what's actually happening to girls in our communities. So we're just not going to get people coming forward as well.
Yeah, I think that's been quite powerful evidence that we've heard from a number of witnesses in terms of the sometimes the family dynamics. And it takes me on to something else that you said in your submission about the FGM protection orders could, in certain circumstances, empower families to protect their daughters. Where do you think situations like that might arise, given what you've said a minute ago?
Yeah, so in some situations we know that mothers themselves, for example, they would want to seek the order because, FGM is also, it's multifaceted. So in some of our cases, in about 20% or 20 to 25% of our cases, it accompanies domestic abuse. And at that point of leaving a relationship as well, the woman would also as well seek for an FGM protection order for her daughter. So it's about giving her that agency and that power to not only take that stance about protecting herself, but also protecting her child as well. And that's a very empowering thing for a mother as well. And when you come from a community where it's a very, very collectivist, where you make a journey in life not by yourself, but other people as well, and so relationships become very enmeshed. Standing out of that, it's a very powering thing for a woman as well. So for us, some women, we have supported them in seeking the order for themselves. We work very closely with a few barristers as well who will represent the woman in court pro bono, because we know that if you don't qualify for legal aid, you will have to pay for it, and some women just cannot afford it. To serve the order as well requires, if it's taken out by the individual, requires that individual to have to pay to get the order served. And by us being able to lobby on their behalf, at the moment there's also a pilot that's being done by the police as well with regard, and I could talk about that a bit later on if you're interested in it. So the police will be able to serve that order as well on behalf of the parent, which in itself is very supportive, and it shows that there's a team around this parent supporting them, which is also a very empowering thing when you come from a situation where you've lost power and control over your life because of interpersonal violence in relationships as well.
And you say that you've been involved in gaining 35 FGM protection orders. I wonder if you could give us as a committee just a wee bit about your experience of doing that, and perhaps provide some examples on the type of requirements that are in FGM protection orders, like the length of time they last.
Yeah. So we have been involved in 35 protection orders. So just thinking about our model as well is that our social workers, they're based, our project workers based within local authorities. And in those particular cases, when we do the assessment, at that point in time, our advice would be for the local authority that an FGM protection order is that's what's needed. And we play a crucial part in driving that, and then also in risk assessing and planning around safety and making recommendations of what conditions should be actually included in the FGM protection order. So we have written, our social workers and project workers as well written court reports in relation to FGM protection orders. We have been commissioned by local authorities independently, so we are based in 11 local authorities at the moment, but we get commissioned by other local authorities asking us to write a court report looking at if it's either at that point in time they may have an interim order and if the order is actually really needed, or if the order should be overturned. And we have had situations where we have said to the court, look, the risk has been reduced. We have done the intervention, the educational work with the parent and with the child as well. And under those circumstances, we have made recommendations for those orders to be removed as well. Now, with our FGM, with the work that we've done around FGM protection orders as well, is that we have developed leaflets for communities, for parents, because as I said a bit earlier on, they're poorly understood as well. And I know that there's a second part to your question as well that I forgot to answer.
Just in relation to, well, I think you actually have answered it. It was in relation to some of the requirements, examples of requirements that might be in place, and you've referred a wee bit to that, in particular around the length of time.
So we've had some orders been made until the girl reaches majority, until she's 18. We've had some until she's 16. We recently recommended in one court order that it's up to the age of 16, but with some intervention being done until she reaches the age of 11 to the end of primary school. So it all depends on the circumstances of the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Can I ask, just to finish off, Convener, I've got a couple of other questions that I'll try and bring together. Can I ask what your view on the criminalisation of the breach of an FGM protection order, and if you've got any views on the penalty that's been set?
Right. For us, yeah, so because we know that, yes, breach of the order is a criminal offence. And if we go back to forced marriage protection orders, how it was originally considered to be not a criminal offence if you breach the order. And then later on it was changed to it being a criminal offence. For us, FGM is a huge human rights violation. There must be some consequences for violating it. We know that some survivors as well, or victim survivors, they don't want their parents to be prosecuted, but some see it as a need because it sends a very strong message. So views are very much divided on it. I would say that it is a human rights violation. It has serious consequences and implications for the lives of women and girls. We know across the world as well, some girls have died because of it. And criminalization, for an act like that is something that, it should be considered. It also ties in with the view that, the act itself polices a woman or a girl's body in a way that no other piece of legislation does. There's the racialized element of it as well. But I would probably say that the more that we find out about FGM and we begin to understand it, we know that the idea that it criminalizes a certain group of people, it would probably end up being on shaky grounds, because we have worked with families from over 65 countries, and as well, it happens in Russia. We have worked on a case with a Russian woman who was cut and had children as well. We have worked with, I probably wouldn't say work, but we know of a case of someone that contacted us. It was a white woman who is from the African continent. I wouldn't narrow it down to a country right now. And we know that there was a case that was in the newspapers around a white American woman as well who was cut. So our growing understanding of it and evidence shows that, yes, it's much more broader than we think that it is. And if we really want to ensure that that we send the message that it's not about them against us, and that it affects not just one group, but it's growing, and it would affect other groups as well. We should look at it much more broadly. We have worked with white British women as well who married a partner or is in a relationship with a partner from an FGM affected country, and they themselves had to go to court to seek an FGM protection order as well. So I would say that it's much more broader than we think.
And what about the second part about your view on the penalties and in Scotland, on summary conviction, it's imprisonment for a period of no longer than 12 months or a fine not exceeding the statutory maximum, and then on indictment, on indictment it's the same as in England and Wales, imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years or a fine or both. What's your thoughts on that?
I suppose that how long would be long enough and what sentence will be fitting? It's kind of like, for me, a difficult question to answer. But I think that, I would probably say that 5 years or a fine would be suitable. I don't think, compared to other forms of, other offences, that it's too draconian at all.
I appreciate that's a really difficult question to answer. No,
Yeah,
thank you for doing so.
Yeah.
Happy with that.
Supplementary to that.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a further question. I absolutely understand when you say that a young girl who has been cut quite often doesn't want her parents to be criminalised. But can I just ask, in that case, when you are working with a young girl who has been cut, what work, if any, do you do with the parents to raise awareness of what they have done to their child? And do you do any work with the broader family to raise awareness of the issue of FGM?
Yeah, so the approach that we take is that we try to work with the entire family. And the work with the parents involves educational work. So it's really thinking about what is their idea of why FGM happens, because we know there's a lot of myth that's associated with it, and then trying to debunk some of those myths. So if we know that it's in relation to it's a religious requirement, that would be the focus. We're very much focused on a child rights approach and a human rights approach. So we help parents to understand what is bodily integrity, what is child rights. We look at as well around the health implications around FGM. Now, I think that sometimes the mistake that we make is that we speak about FGM in the singular, when we know that we should look at it in plural, because there are many different types of FGM, there are many different reasons why it's done. So, that's the focus of the work that we try to do with the parents as well, and also tell them about the law as well. Sometimes parents think that, where they were originally from, people have moved on, and FGM is no longer an issue. And we have to then look at the international landscape with that parent, and especially the country where they are from, and help them to understand that it is still very much a live issue there, and the work that's being done in their where they're originally from, to end the cases of FGM, or even that there's a law in their country which they probably would not be aware of. We try to include the wider family as well, but some of that also depends very much on parents giving us that consent, and allowing us to be in contact with the wider family within the community as well. So that is still, I will say that probably is still a bit of a struggle. But the direct work that we do with the family, it's also around doing it together. So in some situations we do it together, the child and the parent. We work with them individually, separately, and then we bring them together as well.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. In your evidence so far, and I think in your written submission, you talk about helping over 260 adult and child survivors of FGM. We've heard in other evidence that the support is just as important as the other aspects that an order might bring. Can you tell us about what support is available in England and how that interacts with FGM protection orders?
So we know that support is very much a postcode lottery. If you live in London, there is an FGM, there's an organization that's called the Dahlia Project, and it's the only counseling service that's available for women. And but the whole idea of counselling within some communities is a very new idea. So we have to be very creative on how, when we think about counselling, it's not in our understanding of it. For when we think about children as well, the support, especially around medical support, is very sparse. In some local authorities is very non-existent. For example, we only have one dedicated FGM clinic based at University College Hospital. As I said a bit earlier, we don't have, when we think about medical support, we don't have medical experts available who will be able to also examine girls. We have no support services at all because FGM affects men as well. There's very few organizations out there that's dedicated towards supporting men in enabling them to change their attitude around FGM as well. When we think about as well support for girls within schools, that's very limited as well. So it's just looking at the points where girls or women interact with different organizations, institutions, and what support they can provide. I would say that it's very limited. One good step recently was the FGM non-pregnant women clinics has been opened up in a number of points across the country. So we know in Croydon in London, there's one in Brent as well. There's another clinic there. And as part of that, because a lot of work has been directed towards pregnant women, but what about non-pregnant women? And at those clinics as well, there's therapeutic support for women, which for us, it's one of the best things that actually can happen. Because at the point where we engage with women, sometimes for our workers, they would say to them that it's the first time anyone has ever taken the opportunity to talk to me about FGM. And these are women who've been through the healthcare system, been to their GPs, given birth to children, and no one actually had that conversation with them. So even with mandatory recording, now that's one of the key things is that in the department, in the guidance for health professionals, they talk about mandatory recording, but it doesn't say that you have to ask the question is mandatory. So you can record it and it's mandatory, but it isn't mandatory asking the question. So that means that if I don't ask the question, then I don't have to record it. And we do know that women are still not asked the question as well. So if you're not being asked a question, that means that you're not being provided, you're not given the opportunity to get the support that that's needed. And even if you do ask the question, we know that there's limited support out there for these women.
That's very helpful. One of the other things that we've heard on some of the committee visits is concerns where people maybe feel that they don't have secure access to housing, or they're concerned about their immigration status.
Yes.
And it's whether sort of support like that should be part of the order itself, whether you think that when the courts are granting a protection order, they should look at the support that sits alongside some of the other actions. Is that something that happens in England?
Yeah, so we know that in some of our cases, yes, so housing is an issue, and also immigration. With some families, there's no recourse, the issue around no recourse to public funds, which in itself is a minefield. With immigration support, because we work closely with, as I said, with some law firms, and they're willing to provide that advice and legal advice for the parents, for family members, free of charge. But it all depends as well where they're actually located. So that in itself is very, when we think about support, immigration support and advice is very sparse. And I think that housing as well, I think to include that as part of the condition for an order would be a very difficult thing, because housing stock is very limited. For us, we would say that yes, for sure, if there's a need there, and this is a need, housing and immigration support, yes, it should be provided. But then how are local authorities, especially around housing, going to respond to that? I think it's a difficult ask.
Okay. Thank you. My next question was actually on free legal advice, and whether or not, again, you think that that's something that should be automatic in cases involving FGM protection orders.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that, because as I said, is that FGM is it's a huge human rights violation. Not only when it happens, but the risk of it happening as well. There's great fear, especially when it intertwines with the whole idea around honor-based abuse. and the threat and safety to someone's life. Sometimes parents may feel that they're being punished twice because they've left their country, let's say as a refugee coming here seeking asylum, and for anyone to uproot themselves to leave their homeland, and especially where there's concerns around FGM, the reasons why they have traveled here to the UK to seek refuge, and then when they come here as well, the fear that they will be returned home, because I know of a few cases where the family member, the parent, have been told that they can go back to their country but go to a different part of the country. And it may seem very logical because in our context, yes, you could leave London and you could come to Scotland, and you might be able to fit in. But when you think about, in some countries where if you going to another part of the country, it's not from your ethnic group, and the conflicts between ethnic group as well. You may say that, well, you don't need to say who you are, but you're very identifiable. Even if you have, let's say, scarification, people would know who you belong to and which group it is. And the long history of conflict between different groups. So it's just not as easy to say that you can go to another part of the country. And it's a real fear for some parents as well. So they feel as if they're being punished twice.
Just seeing it, Letha mentioned asylum there and refugees. Could you just expand a bit more? I think, Oliver mentioned that when we were out meeting with workers, one of the things that they said that they felt would be most helpful would be if FGM protection orders could influence the asylum applications and the immigration system. And I think we probably, we've had a response from the UK government on that, and I think we see that it's not maybe as we would wish it to be, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the cases that you've been involved in, and if FGM protection orders were ever used as helpful evidence towards these asylum claims, and if not, whether you think they should be.
I think it should be. Yes, we've had cases where there have been immigration issues, and I think in the recent case that was before the court in England, where yes, the family court should do their own risk assessment, but that risk assessment where, let's say, the risk is high if the child or the family member returns to their home country, the Home Secretary could disregard the advices given by the family court with regard to the level of risk. But I think it does play a very strong part in driving the decision by immigration with regard to risk as well. So I think that in all circumstances it should be considered, and the family court should continue to do their own risk assessment with regard to the risk of that child, because it still does have some weight in the decision that's going to be made going forward. So I would say that yes, for sure, that it does have some weight as well. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. I also want to come back, because I think you'd mentioned the sort of racial profiling element before, and I just wondered, we've heard the suggestion made that FGM protection orders could lead to racial profiling by professionals, and it's just what your views were on that, and if there was any evidence that that had been the outcome in England.
Yeah, I would agree. I would probably say that if we look at it in the context of, so is it the order that does that, or is it about people's attitude towards others, really? And should we target people's attitudes towards others to help them to change their views? And I think that that's really around cultural competence. But I do know that, yes, that some communities, they have been affected by just not FGM protection orders, but just the approach that's taken in different local authorities as well. But so as I say, is that the order, or is that just people's attitudes towards others? And does the order actually make that worse? But I would probably say that we must remember that FGM protection orders, they're given within the context of within a legal framework, and it's not that individual that's granting the order. Yes, they will have to give evidence, but you actually really left up to court based on what they're hearing to then grant the order. And even if it's an interim order, parents can go to court to have the order dispelled removed. So I would probably say that yes, that some communities do feel very much affected by it. They feel that they're being targeted, and I would say that it goes beyond just FGM protection orders as well. They feel scapegoated. They feel it does tie in with other wider issues as well. So if we think about Islamophobia and how some communities feel about that, and it becomes very enmeshed. They don't separate one from the other. They just see it because it's my total experience of living in a society where I'm being othered, and this is just another thing as well.
Thank you for that. I wondered whether, just as a supplementary, your work as a national centre, whether you feel the sort of pilot projects and having individuals based within local authorities,
Yes.
As this has been rolled out, has that made any difference, do you think, to how professionals work?
Yeah. So as I said, so we're based in 11 local authorities, but we have workers in the front line within children's social care in 10. In one local authority, it involves doing work around the new relationship and sex education curriculum and consulting parents and communities and children and young people themselves on what do they think about the measure and what should be included within the content of the material that's going to be taught to students as well. So I would, and in the other local authorities, it's really about, as I said, it's about how do we bring about a system change in how they respond. And you know, some local authorities where we have been based since 2015, the outcome of our interventions there, because we've been longer, I think it's reaping a lot of benefits and rewards because the approach is multi-agency response. So we involved all partners, education, health. When we work in a local authority, we work with community organizations on the ground, and that helps us drive the work around community engagement as well. I wouldn't deny that there are challenges as well, because to change attitudes, to change your approach, to adapt your work as well, and to engage different professionals to talk about FGM, it's a difficult thing in itself because sometimes practitioners they're afraid to respond, or they respond in a very knee-jerk way. So, for example, we had one referral where it's a black family that's going to Barbados on holiday. I mean, I'm from the Caribbean. Barbados is very close to where I'm from, and I just can't understand why a professional would be concerned that a family is going on holiday to Barbados. So some of the work that we do is not only around intervening and supporting family, but it's about that professional development and helping professionals to have that confidence to ask the question and how to ask the question as well in a very trauma-informed way. Because we've heard of cases where a woman has been showed an image and asking her, what type of FGM do you have? And FGM is a very traumatic thing for most women, and being shown an image, talking about it that way, is not a very trauma-informed way at all, and it would obviously take her back to that point where she's being cut. So it's about helping professionals to respond in the right way and not be anxious about it, and helping them to understand it's just as any other safeguarding concern, and try to allay their fears and give them that skills. So asking the question for us is one of the most important things that we think that we need to support professionals with. There's something as simple as that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mary.
Convener, there was 3 areas I wanted to ask you about, and the first of those was guidance. And I'd be keen to hear your view on whether you think there is a benefit to guidance being statutory as opposed to advisory. There already exists multi-agency advice and guidance across Scotland about FGM, but we've certainly heard of you while we've been taking evidence that guidance should be statutory. And is that something that you would agree with? And perhaps you could give us your thoughts on what would be beneficial to be in both the guidance about FGM and the guidance around FGM protection orders. Is there something specific that we could include that would be helpful?
Right, I think that there is benefit in having the guidance statutory. I think when we think about the history of just having guidance and its advisory, professionals don't, I mean, sometimes it's statutory and professionals don't even refer to it, and it's statutory, so far more if it's advisory. We know that in the work that we do around child abuse linked to faith and belief, back in 2007, the government had, it was non-statutory guidance, and virtually no one actually knew about it. And it just then faded away and is not even referred to at all. So at least in the statutory guidance, if the statutory guidance as well includes an aspect of it where it places a responsibility on chief execs, directors of children's social care and other departments, and says that it's your responsibility. So they must adhere to what's written in that guidance as well. It creates a level of accountability at a very high level, which ensures that accountability is then cascaded down to the frontline professionals. So I would say that to have it as statutory guidance, I think it's really important, and it's a correct step to take. So what should be included within the statutory guidance? So I had a look at the 2017 multi-agency guidance for Scotland, and I think that that's a step in the right direction. It mirrors as well with the guidance for the rest of the UK, England and Wales. But what should be included in it? I think that there is something around FGM being it's because it's a global issue, and professionals must have that understanding of what happened. So it's about thinking global but acting local. So because within 4 families, the international context does play a part, and I think that guidance should include an element of that as well. It should include the best approach to work with families. So what does the evidence say about what works? Should be included as well, so give them some tips. And I think that the guidance as well should include, when we think about FGM, there's a part of it that where professionals just speak to professionals. They don't speak to who would really know about the families. They don't engage with places of worship. And if there is a part of the guidance as well that speaks to communities and help them to understand their part in it as well, even if that part of it could look at how to engage with communities in the best way and how to respond to communities and helping communities as well. So I mean, this probably wouldn't be around the statutory guidance, but if it's written in the other way around, so some form of guidance for communities about engaging with professionals, because we know that there's a lack of trust between communities, and in order for us to actually make a dent or change attitudes, it's about us engaging with them and how best they can also engage with us to try to bridge that gap. Now, with FGM protection orders in the guidance as well, I think some tips around what types of, guidance are written not with your case in mind, because it's very general, and then we have to try to adapt it to the families that we work with. And from my experience, some practitioners struggle when we think about safety planning and what should actually be included in the FGM protection orders. So if some tips looking at existing case law and what conditions were included within the orders would help professionals to understand what should be included. But I think that another part of it as well with the FGM protection orders and conditions as well is that the role of how to serve the orders. So in one particular case that I know of is that the order was granted here. The family members live in another country, but the order was served to that person via WhatsApp, and they used another family member to serve that order. So you need to think about very creative ways of doing it. and taking in consideration, you know, the internet and how useful it is and all these different electronic tools. So things like that should be considered as to be included in the order when we think about FGM protection orders.
No, that's very helpful, and I want to come on and talk about awareness raising and education. But just before I do, I have, I suppose, a bit of a bugbear about guidance, because guidance can be a very, very useful tool, but it does come down to accountability.
Yes.
and the importance that's placed on that guidance. And I'm always concerned that guidance is something that's taken down off a shelf once a year, and people look at it and they put it back on the shelf and they don't actually do anything with it.
Yeah.
So do you think there is a benefit, particularly in relation to guidance around FGM, that is regularly reviewed, refreshed and updated? And if you agree with that, how often should that be done?
Yeah, you're right. You know that the gap between when a professional, let's say for example a social worker, they get a case, to when they decide to refer to the guidance, could be a very good long gap. So they get all the training now, the guidance is issued, and then 2-3 years down the line, that's when they get a case, and that's when they will decide to open the guidance, or even remember that there's guidance there, and that's the danger. But what I would say, how to get around that, is that it's always how could we put at different points. Am I saying this correctly? What I'm trying to say is that FGM overlaps with many different issues. So if there is guidance on mental health, for example, FGM must be there, because we know that there are a number of cases where parents, mothers experience, you know, they have mental health needs in relation to the FGM. We know that it overlaps with domestic abuse, so have it included there as well. So that means that it stays alive, it stays on people's mind, and it isn't something that just moves away. Now, with the time frame with regard to how, when it should be reviewed or revamped, or what I would probably say is that, I mean, that's a really difficult question, really. What's the right time frame? I think in any organization, all guidance or even policies should be reviewed and reconsidered on an annual basis. What needs to change in the context as well as that in England, we know that in public health they do the joint needs strategic assessment, the JSNA, and at that point, because that's done in some contexts annually as well, and if within the JSNA it includes FGM, and so that way is also kept alive. What is in our local areas it telling us about FGM? What learning do we then need to disseminate? We know that one other issue as well is when we think about violence against women and girls, and when we look at domestic homicide reviews, the ones that I've looked at with a woman, for example, from a practicing FGM affected community, is that there's no mention of even ethnicity. Sometimes there's no mention around FGM. FGM had an overlap with that. So I think that I think we're doing a disjustice to women and girls because we just look at it as a single issue. We don't look at it with the totality of their lives. We talk about FGM as well in a very deficit model. We don't think about, there are many women and girls who, are very resilient, very empowered, but what makes them who they are is not the FGM, it's other aspects of their lives. So that in itself should be a focus and celebrated, and that way just it's kept on the agenda. But just going back to your question as well, as going back to your question about the time frame, just to recap, I think it's something that all policies annually should be reviewed. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will change, but it should be on the agenda and reviewed annually.
But I suppose if you have true multi-agency working together in collaboration across professionals, and if it is on the agenda or in the guidance that is issued to all those different professionals, if one body picks up something, they could highlight it to another organisation if there was that proper multi-agency working?
Yeah, so I think that's where the local safeguarding partnerships, previously local safeguarding children's board, should play a part in driving that, because that is that is multi-agency, even though it has reduced to only some groups now, some statutory agencies. But that's the point where I think it should be considered. Or even health and well-being boards as well. They should play a part as well. I think that as well in local authorities, that lead counsellor for children, that counsellor who will responsibility for children, it should be placed on their agenda as well, and they should take it on board. And as I said, just don't look at it for us as a single issue. For us, it's always FGM plus something else.
Okay. Can I come on now to ask you about education? Because in England, teaching FGM in schools is mandatory. I wonder if you could briefly tell the committee what that looks like and what benefits that has brought.
Well, it will be mandatory from September 2020. So it's not mandatory at the 2020. So it's not mandatory at the moment. And it will only be for secondary schools as well, not primary schools. We think that it's a step in the right direction, but I think that knowing that FGM happens at a much younger age in most communities, it's something that should be considered to be taught in primary school. I've had the experience of going to one primary school where it is part of this curriculum in the school, sat in with a class of year 3 students, and the approach that was used, it was embedded within the science curriculum in that school. And when you walk into the school, there's a strong ethos around the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and these children, they knew their rights pretty well. So it was the science and the UN CRC that was combined. And I think, for me, my experience was that these children grasped it. They understood it pretty well. They asked very informed questions. Some questions I think that adults wouldn't even actually really think about. And then I got the opportunity to meet with a group of year 6 students who actually go into secondary schools to teach about FGM. Now, that school shows that if it's done in a very creative and engaging way, and it's pitched at a level that the year group will be able to understand, not using any images, because I think as an adult we have that anxiety that images will be used. It's because people use the terms like unhelpful terms like barbaric, and the language around that alienates people. So they don't use any language like that at all with these primary school children, and it's taught from year 1 to year 6, and if they can do it, others can do it. And in 2017, we trained that school, we worked with them to develop the curriculum, a whole school approach, which involved training as well teachers, school governor, and also sessions for parents as well. And then they went into 10 primary schools in London and shared that knowledge with the members of staff, who will then go into their classroom and replicate that as well. So for us, it can work, but I understand parents' anxieties about it, and that's part of the reason why we're doing the work that we're doing in one local authority around the RSC curriculum.
Okay. You've spoken a bit about awareness raising, and I wonder if you think it would be beneficial to do awareness raising across all communities in Scotland rather than just specific groups of people. I
agree, because at the heart of this is about patriarchy. It's about inequality, and we know that other communities, especially when we think about women, they experience inequality as well across the board, and that's what patriarchy does. So I think that yes, in the approach, it's not just only looking at, if you start off at a very broad context, helping people to understand the different forms of inequality that women experience and double inequality because of who they are, and then narrowing it down to look at different examples and including FGM within that. I think that you will probably hit a number of different targets and just not FGM, because you're starting to have a wider conversation. So that's the approach, is that yes, don't narrow it down to one particular group. Just look at inequality on its broadest scale, and work with many different groups and help them to understand, because they all have a part to play in it. As I said, that people would marry someone from a different community, and then it will start to affect them. And why would we just think about, targeting one group when we know that inequalities is it's felt equally across all groups.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, FGM is very much a taboo issue. It's not something that's in our kind of everyday conversation, and by doing the kind of stuff that you talk about would help to break that taboo.
Yes, and I think as well as that communities as well feel that there's inequality in the sense that if, yes, say for example, a white British woman could have certain procedures done and is not considered to be something that's bad, or negative, but with another group, something that's slightly similar, that's how they view it, and we're being targeted for this, but not this group. That's why this group, should be included in that discussion as well. To try to, start to have that dialogue between the different communities and different groups, and trying to understand it.
Okay. Are you aware of any successful interventions in other countries to help to tackle FGM? And are there any alternative approaches that the Scottish Government could perhaps consider?
Yes, so we are part of the End EU FGM network. And what I would probably say is that when we think about prosecutions, yes, people talk about France. But that's if you want to go down that route of prosecuting parents. In other European countries, I think that they're probably steps behind the UK, but still there are lessons to learn from them as well. Because I think that, the work that we have done in the UK should be celebrated, because there are a number of important measures that's been put in place over the years since the Girl Generation Conference in 2014. When we think about, for example, like Kenya, probably wouldn't apply to us, having those safe houses for girls to flee to go to. I think that, community engagement in France seem to be, from the organizations that we interact, it seems to be a good thing. We all recently had a visit from an organization from Finland coming to learn about the work that we do here in the UK and at the centre, our model. And from their view, there's a step behind. So I'll probably say it's the reverse. We have made a lot of strides, and people come to us to see how it works here and to see and our model as well. But I think that when we think about community engagement as well, in countries where it's affected, FGM affected, we could learn a lot from them. The way how they engage, the approach that they use, and because it's very much a live issue there, more there than us. So recently, in the summer, I went to a country where there's a high prevalence of FGM, and the approaches that they use there around engaging women, it's very much because when we think about it, the communities affected by FGM here, poverty and deprivation does affect these communities more than others. And so in the country that I went to, the drive is really much about empowering women around providing economic stability as well. So because it gives them agency, it ensures that they don't have to depend on others who play a part in ensuring that they can eat on a daily basis. So one thing that we can learn from here as well is that how do we empower women and give them that sense of independence and agency where they don't feel pressured by family members as well, who they themselves are dependent on as well.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Annie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. In your submission, you stated your views on the additional provisions that are available regarding FGM down in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, with the fact of anonymity for victims,
Yes.
offence and failure to protect, and also duty to notify. Can you explain a little bit more your sort of thoughts on those three, and what's your view that Scotland is taking a different approach and not including those three additional provisions in our legislation?
Right, so sorry, it's anonymity.
Anonymity, yes, for the victim, failure to protect, and also duty to notify police.
Okay, is that,
Or
so the last one
professionals.
is around mandatory reporting?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I would probably say that for us, victim anonymity is a step in the right direction, and the anonymity should start at that point where the allegation is made. Anonymity, ensuring that that's provided around yes, publication of names, location. But what I would say is in location, when a case goes to court. And it goes, let's say, to a court in Bristol, we know that that would most likely be that the family lives close by.
Yeah.
And then it becomes very easy as well to try to identify that person, or even the professionals that are involved in those cases. So is there a need to also to consider that probably the professionals who are involved in those cases are not named as well, because people could then start narrowing. When you come from a community, it's very easy to narrow down who it is.
Yeah.
And then it's very easy to send that message back home, what's happening as well. With anonymity, to breach it, we know that the responsibility, for example, for newspapers is placed on the editors, not the actual journalists. I'm not sure what's the answer, but the question would be for me is that why not that individual as well? So why only the editor, not the actual journalist who played a part in actually writing that article? But for us, generally, victim anonymity is a positive. It is the right step in the right direction. But what happens? Another question that I've always had around in anonymity is that when we think about FGM and within a family context, it's the anonymity should go beyond just that child who's been cut and the parents. Because what happens to the siblings who are not born yet, or the siblings who are not involved in that particular case, and so anonymity should also obviously include around them. When we think about around failure to protect, yes.
Question about anonymity. Do you think it should be automatic, or do you think it should be the choice of the girl or the woman whether she remains anonymous?
I think for children, it should be automatic, because sometimes when we just think about think about the situation in broad terms, that a child may make a decision now and they're unaware of how it's going to affect them in adulthood. I mean, they could apply for an adult as well at this point in time, yes. They may say, I don't want anonymity. And anonymity, in some sense, removes that power and control from that woman to make the decision about her life. And so I think it should be considered on a case-by-case basis, but the default will be to start at that starting point when the allegation is made that they are given that anonymity. Yeah.
Thank you.
So failure to protect, what I would, I mean, when we think about what failure to protect as well, is that we don't have much evidence of, or at the moment, of how does it actually really work. And I think it's very difficult to prove failure to protect. I think it would be a challenge. Does it have symbolic value? I would probably say yes, it does. But does that mean that it should be included in legislation? I think because when it came in, and the work that we've done with parents, saying to them that it's your responsibility to protect your child. If something happens to your child and you have that responsibility, you will be held responsible for it. And it's a strong message to send to a parent. It's a strong message to send to other family members as well. And failure to protect is not only around parental responsibility. It's who has responsibility for that child at that point in time. It applies to them as well. So a grandparent who takes that child on holiday, they have that responsibility to protect and safeguard that child at a point in time. So failure to protect would apply in that context. But I think that we're still at very early stages around this entire issue around failure to protect. And we don't know if it's a useful thing, but it's still a strong message to send. And around mandatory reporting, so mandatory reporting based on anecdotal evidence and from talking to professionals, we know that it isn't working as we think that it should. It should work. people question why should there be mandatory reporting for FGM and not for other forms of abuse. It's still poorly understood. Even last week at our team meeting, we were talking about a case where it involved an adult woman, and that health professional dialed 101 to report mandatory reporting when it doesn't apply to adults. So it's still poorly understood, it's still being misused. And in that particular case, it then resulted in police actually turning up at the address without any form of strategy meeting or discussions with other professionals. It was a knee-jerk reaction. So I think that the mandatory reporting, it's probably not a good measure. Yeah.
And just to sort of finish off from me, what's your view that the Scottish Government's taken a different approach to the UK Government, not introducing these three measures? Does it create a sort of a difference just within of the understanding across the United Kingdom that there's going to be a slightly different?
Yes. Yeah, I think it. I think my view is that victim anonymity is a good thing, and it should be considered by the Scottish Government.
Yeah.
I think it does send a message that, just across the border, they have a different approach. We know that in the Department for Education Child and Need Census, which was published last week, right there in Newcastle, local authorities did 43 assessments for FGM for that financial year. So we know that if it's an issue there and there's a different approach as used, legal approach as used there, how does that impact upon families here in Scotland and vice versa? I think that so I would ask to reconsider this, especially around the issue around victim anonymity, because it does send a different message.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Convener.
I'll let you in just a second. I suppose just to go back a bit to the failure to protect, I'll be interested to hear your reflections. You mentioned that a lot of the women that you work with are actually experiencing other forms of violence in their home. How would you reflect on the sort of the fact that actually the mother might be being coerced and controlled at the same time as there's harm to the child? I suppose I'm asking if we have failure to protect, is there a risk we're going to punish women again?
Okay. I think that is an interesting question, actually. But I would probably say that for us being I know the dynamics of how FGM actually really happens. Women, for example, would be unable to say no. They will be unable to stand up against their family members. And so it will seem as if we persecuting someone who actually have a different view around FGM. Because in some communities, yes, the child does not belong to the mother. It belongs to the wider family or even the man's family as well. And if the mother is voicing that concern that FGM should not happen, and then it does happen, and then she's prosecuted for that under failure to protect, it does seem a bit unfair. So I would agree. We're not dealing with a foolproof system as well. So the answer to that really is about how do we ensure that we engage with communities, especially mothers who find themselves in that situation, to help them to understand that there is support out there for them. We know that from the work that we have done, where we have encouraged mothers themselves to apply for the FGM protection orders in their own right and provide the legal advice from the solicitor barristers that we work with who will do it pro bono. But many women are unaware of that. So I would say that yes, there is that possibility that a woman could be who is not inclined to cut her child at all, could be as well be held responsible for what has happened to her child. And that's.
And just to, so there's two more folk wanting to come in. I just to press you a little bit more on mandatory reporting. We've heard from workers and some health professionals in Scotland that it can be potentially damaging to a relationship. You gave an example of a professional having a knee-jerk reaction or overreaction. Do you think that mandatory reporting could contribute to that side of things? I mean, obviously we don't want anybody colluding with anyone that's going to do harm to a child, but there are relationships to think of in different aspects.
Any type of reporting could affect the relationship. So we know that if we just step out of mandatory reporting, if you have a general safeguarding concern as a professional and you make a referral, it is going to affect the relationship anyway. So why have mandatory reporting, which from all the evidence that we have so far shows that it's not really working. Some of the research that's not done here in the UK, that's done overseas, does show that mandatory reporting for some professionals, they find a way of getting out of it, because they don't agree with it. Yes, it can affect the relationship between a health professional and their patient. And in the case that I spoke about a bit earlier, with that 18-year-old, she waited until she turned 18 to disclose the FGM because she didn't want her parents to be prosecuted. So which then results in a barrier around disclosures for women who would want to be able to seek support and help. So it does have, that is a consequence of mandatory reporting, but in general terms, any form of reporting would be considered to be a bad thing.
I'm wondering if, I think, I'm sure UK-wide, that in terms of child protection, that everyone that is in contact with children is very clear about their responsibilities and what they have to do. And I'm just thinking that the example you gave there of it going wrong was somebody reporting an adult. So,
because as I said, it's still very much poorly understood. You even find, for example, cases where it should have been referred and it hasn't been referred. So it all goes back to that I think that there's some professionals that's still very much fearful of what is going to happen, because they're hearing about cases of where it's not being responded to appropriately. You have cases where we've had the experience of within the health sector, just because a woman's been cut, and they just refer when that health professional should be doing their risk assessment, because the Department for Health Guidance says that, and their risk assessment tools for health professionals, based on your risk assessment, then make that determination if the case should be referred, but they just make blanket referrals. And it has implications for community cohesion and engagement as well, because people would feel that they're being targeted. So it's about, which says something about confidence. It says something about probably othering others as well. And then it has implications for children's social care, how they actually respond to those cases. So,
thank you. Angela wanted to come in, and then Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. It's been really interesting to listen to your evidence this morning, Mr Bartholomew, that's based on your experience in England and Wales. And I think what I've heard clearly is that in terms of mandatory reporting, you've said it's not working as it was intended, it's poorly understood. In terms of the failure to protect, I think you've given a very quite nuanced evidence, highlighted some of the pros and cons. You've been very balanced, and you're very much in favour of anonymity, automatic anonymity. I suppose what I wanted to draw your attention to a bit more is the context for Scotland. So there are obviously regulatory bodies where professional social care workers, social workers, there are UK-wide, health regulatory bodies that, there are consequences when people don't perform their duty to care in terms of their future careers. The convener spoke about our domestic abuse legislation that is different to what is south of the border, and at an even more fundamental level, our children's hearing system is very different, and our legal system is different. And just now, nobody in Scotland gets automatic anonymity, but there are procedures, for example, when, you know, there are victims of, you know, a sexual offence. So there is some accommodation, but that is made by our established systems. So I just wondered whether, you know, how, and it's always great to compare and contrast, but I just wondered, you know, what your exposure is to the issues and the organisations in Scotland, and whether, you know, there's some quite nuanced evidence you can give us in relation to that.
Okay. So just to repeat your question, so you're asking around, so it's around anonymity, just to get it clear, so it's around anonymity and...
I'm very clear about what the evidence you've given around mandatory reporting and failure to protect. I suppose, to summarise, in terms of the anonymity issue, is whether you've looked at how our court system operates.
No, I would say no.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oliver, did you have a follow-up?
Thank you very much, Convener. I just wondered, coming back to the failure to protect, I think your answer was very interesting. I just wondered how many cases you're aware of where that sort of come up out of the sort of 260 plus people you've worked with. Does the failure to protect, is it a common thing that's pursued?
No. So the failure to protect. The failure to protect aspect would come into play when it's actually in, because it's an offence. So that will come in where obviously the case is going to court, and that will be one of the offences, failure to protect. Now we know that there's been very few cases. We know there's just been 4, but what I would say is that when we look at the number of cases that we have dealt with, and you know, the narrative that we are given by parents or by girls is that yes, that what happened to them is, some of it is where one parent didn't want it to happen, but the other parent allowed it to happen. So one parent failed to protect that child, and it then goes back to the question that you ask, is that, so what happened to that parent? Could they have actually really said no to it? Would they have been in a position to protect their child? And it's very difficult for that particular parent when you're going against your entire family. When we look at it within the context of, let's say, for example, marriages where one parent is married, I mean, both parents are their cousins, it's the entire family, and to go against them is a very difficult thing. And then to prosecute that parent seems a bit unfair. So the narrative that we're given, the stories, is that yes, that in some contexts, both parents wanted it. So yeah, or a grandparent, or you know. So when we're thinking about FGM, this whole gerontocratic system where it's actually the elderlies are the one that make decisions on behalf of others, and you're very powerless because you can't say no to them. That's a common theme as well. And where you have both parents actually fail to protect that child. So it is a consistent narrative in the cases that we deal with at the centre.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of that evidence session. Thank you very much for all your evidence. That's been extremely helpful. Our next meeting is the 14th of November, when we'll hear from the Minister for Older People and Equalities on the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. And I now move into private session.